Just look at this number, 468%. Now, that's not a 10-year return on some hot stock. Now, that is the gain in a single day for a chip company that most people had never heard of. A company that was losing billions of dollars and, get this, had been blacklisted by the United States. A number this insane isn't just a glitch in the market, it's a message.
It's telling that China's hottest IPO this year is a GPU startup at the center of Beijing's push to break free from NVIDIA and American technology. Now, More Threads IPO, which is 4,100 times oversubscribed in Shanghai, it sits inside of this larger trend. Beijing went from hoarding NVIDIA chips to blocking some of its biggest technology companies from using them in new data centers. So that means forcing them to shift budget and engineers to domestic chips. Now, there's More Threads, but there's also Huawei and Cambricon and rising startups like Byron and Medax. They're building different pieces of a system, all designed to make the country less dependent on American chips.
So you've got to ask yourself, right? How does that happen? How does a company with everything stacked against it pull off one of the most explosive stock market debuts ever? Well, the answer isn't just about one company. It's about a whole nation's all-or-nothing bet on its technological survival. And that's exactly what we're digging into in this Explainer. We're going behind that number to unpack a much bigger story, China's incredible race for what's called silicon sovereignty. This is about way more than just computer chips. This is about fundamentally redrawing the tech map of the entire world. So here's how we're going to break this all down. To really get what that IPO means, we have to look at the whole story. We'll start with the crazy IPO itself, then we'll uncover the silicone chokehold that's driving this whole thing. Then we'll look at the massive $47 billion war chest China's built to fight back, meet the national champions they're betting on, and see how they're literally building a parallel tech universe. And finally, we'll ask the big question, what on earth does this mean for the rest of us? Alright, first things first, that wild, nearly 400% jump. The company at the heart of all this is called More Threads. They're a startup from Beijing, and a lot of people are calling them China's NVIDIA. But when they went public, well, it was less of an IPO and more of a geopolitical statement. Okay, so just look at these numbers with me. From a purely financial point of view, they make absolutely no sense. The offering was oversubscribed, get this, 2,750 times. It pulled in over $1 billion for a company that was still losing money hand over fist. And let me remind you, a company on a US trade blacklist. So here's the key takeaway. People weren't just buying a stock, they were buying a piece of a national mission. This was a massive vote of confidence that China can and will build its own tech future no matter what it takes. And that brings us to the really important question. Why? Why this level of desperation? Why this kind of market mania? It all boils down to one critical vulnerability, a weakness that China is now obsessed with eliminating. The whole problem is this idea of a technological choke point. It sounds complicated, but it's simple. Imagine you're building something huge, like a skyscraper, but there's one special kind of screw made by only one company in the world that holds the whole thing together. If they decide to stop selling you that screw, your entire project grinds to a halt. For China's tech industry, that's not just a bad dream, it's their reality. And here are the most critical choke points. You've got these insane EUV machines, the only things on Earth that can print the most advanced chips. Then there's the EDA software, basically the digital blueprints you need to even design a chip in the first place. On top of that, you need special gases and materials, and the super fast memory, called HBM, that makes modern AI possible. If you don't control these things, someone else controls your destiny. So, what do you do when you find yourself in a chokehold like that? Well, China's response wasn't exactly subtle. It didn't bring a scalpel, it brought a sledgehammer. Let's talk about this $47.5 billion war chest they've put together. $47.5 billion. Let that sink in for a second. That's the staggering amount of money poured into just the third phase of China's giant national chip fund, which everyone just calls the Big Fund. And to give you some perspective, this one phase is bigger than the first two phases combined. This isn't just an investment fund, it's basically a declaration of economic war. And what's really fascinating is watching how the fund's strategy has evolved. Back in 2014, Phase 1 was kind of a broad spray and pray approach, just boosting production in general. Phase 2 got a little more focused, targeting big factories. But this new Phase 3, it's completely different. It's a precision weapon, laser focused on one thing and one thing only, smashing through those specific choke point technologies we just talked about. And don't think for a second this is just some isolated government project. This is a full-blown, whole-of-nation effort. They're roping in all the country's biggest state-owned banks, telling them to pour billions into this fund. It's like they're redirecting the entire financial bloodstream of the country towards one single goal: total silicon independence. So, you've got this mountain of cash, but who's actually going to do the work? That brings us to the next chapter in this story: the rise of what they call the national champions. These are the companies, from huge giants to hungry startups, that are being handed the mission and the money to make this all happen. And right at the very top of that list, you've got to talk about Huawei. I mean, after years of unbelievable pressure from the US, the company has come roaring back as the clear leader. Their Ascend AI chips, plus all their own software and massive data center clusters, it's become the go-to standard inside China. They're not just selling a product, they're building an entire world for their customers to live in. And this chart really shows you the earthquake that's happening right now. Just last year, NVIDIA basically owned China's AI market. But look at the projection for 2026. Huawei is expected to grab half of the entire market. So here's the crazy irony. US sanctions, which were designed to stop China's AI progress, have actually created this massive protected playground for their own champions to grow and dominate in. Okay, so you can design amazing chips, but can you actually build them? That's where SMIC, China's #1 chip manufacturer, comes in. They've been blocked from buying the world's best chip-making machines, right? So what did they do? They pulled off an incredible engineering miracle. They figured out how to make highly advanced 7nm chips using older, less advanced equipment. It's harder, it's more expensive, but it works. And now, they're trying to use that same brute force ingenuity to get to 5nm. And this is where you have to zoom out and realize what's really going on. This is so much bigger than just replacing a few foreign parts. The real ambition here is to build an entire, self-contained, parallel technological universe. Just look at this. It's like a mirror image. For every single layer of the Western tech world that we all use, a Chinese alternative is being aggressively built and pushed. So instead of the chip design from Intel or ARM, they're all in on an open standard called RISC-V. Instead of Windows or Android, they're pushing their own operating systems. And this is a big one. To break NVIDIA's monopoly on AI, they're building their own software to replace CUDA. They're literally building a different version of everything. So how do you make sure people actually use all this new stuff, especially when the old stuff works so well? It's simple, really. You force them to. Beijing has reportedly created a 50% rule. It says any new chip factory has to buy at least half of its gear from Chinese companies. Just like that, you create a huge, guaranteed market for your local guys, letting them grow and get better at a speed that would be impossible in the free market. Okay, so where does this all lead? What happens to the world when one of its biggest players successfully walls itself off and creates its own technological reality? This is where things get complicated. You know, you don't have to take my word for it. Just listen to this quote from Jensen Huang. He's the CEO of NVIDIA, the very company China is trying to beat, and he's not downplaying them. He's calling Huawei one of the most formidable technology companies the world has ever seen. When your biggest rival is saying that about you, you know the game has totally changed. What we're all living through right now has a name. It's called bifurcation. It just means splitting in two. The world we got used to, the one with a single global tech supply chain where everything worked with everything else, that world is over. In its place, we're getting two separate zones, two tech ecosystems, one led by the US, one by China, and they might not be compatible at all. And that leads us with the biggest question of all. As these two tech worlds drift further and further apart, what happens next? Does this competition spark a new kind of space race pushing innovation forward for everybody? Or are we at the start of a new kind of Cold War, fought with silicon and software, with digital walls going up all around us? Honestly, the answer to that is probably going to define the rest of our lives. Making sense of huge, complex shifts like this race for silicon sovereignty is what we're all about here. We try to turn the complicated into the clear. If you got something out of this, check out our other explainers on the big forces changing our world. Until next time, goodbye from the Explainer.